Hello, BookTube. Over the past week or so, a lot of discussion on Fantasy BookTube has centered around the publication of Time Magazine's 100 Best Fantasy Books of All Time. Alongside Times writers, several respected science fiction and fantasy authors contributed, including N.K. Jemisin, Neil Gaiman, Sabaa Tahir, Tomi Adeyemi, Diana Gabaldon, George R. Martin, Cassandra Clare, and Marlon James. So far, the reception for this list has been, I would say, rather negative from what I've seen. And I generally do share a lot of the criticisms of this list. So the list is organized chronologically, and so the first books shown, or the first books on the list, are the oldest, and the last books on the list are the newest. Excuse me. So I think if I break down the list into different parts, I think it shows that the list does have some merit. There are some good choices on the list, some surprising choices. There are some incredibly strong bits with this list, and there are some bits or parts of the list where you're having to wonder, what the heck were some of these people thinking? So first thing right off the bat, I'm noticing that the first book is the Arabian Nights, a collection of stories from the Middle East that were later collected in France. It's the first book on the list, followed by Le Mart d'Arthur, and then Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. So right off the bat, I'm noticing the Epic of Gilgamesh isn't on here. Neither are the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is the absence of the Iliad and the Odyssey. I think is a bit more infuriating, because there are some Greek mythological retellings later on in the list, which I will rant about when I get to that part of the list. But on the whole, except for the absence of Gilgamesh, Iliad, Odyssey, and I'm thinking, they are also missing The King of Elfland's Daughter is not on here either, which is curious absence. I think the earliest part of the list is pretty good, although it has to be noted that not only are the Alice books individually on here, but so are the constituent parts of The Lord of the Rings, which, given the well-known insistence that it's one book, it's The Lord of the Rings. Yes, they were originally published separately as 3 individual parts, but The Lord of the Rings should be thought of as The Lord of the Rings. And the fact that they are individually on here makes me wonder if it's not a cover for some dirty pool that gets played later on once we get to the more contemporary part of this list. One interesting thing to note about the list is that it does include A Hero Born by Jin Yong, which I thought when I saw it, it was a pleasant It was a pleasant surprise. Quite thrilled to see it on here. Also nice to see James and the Giant Peach and the Phantom Toll Booth on here. And I think I mean, while I'm not an expert on children's fantasy and young adult fantasy, I do think the representation of children's fantasy and young adult fantasy, I think, is quite strong. I think that is the strongest part of this list. Not entirely sure it makes up for some of the glaring deficiencies of the list, which we will get to later. So, one thing that I noticed missing is that there is not, or there is representation of books after Tolkien for adults. There isn't much in the way of adult fantasy representation from like the 60s, 70s, 80s into the 90s and early 2000s. Tad Williams isn't on here. Kenneth Lee isn't on here. Michael Moorcock's not on here. Charles Saunders isn't on here, who most certainly should be on this list. And I mean, several. Susanna Clark, I don't believe is actually on here either. Because I think she should be on here for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. But I don't know for sure. I'm thinking she's not, no, she's not on here. So, I mean, there is that glaring absence. Also, some major writers from more recently, like Joe Abercrombie's not on here, or Scott Lynch. So, anyway. So, I mean, there are some very obvious glaring absences with this list. And one of the problems, I think, are some of the books I'm not entirely sure really should be on here. Or, I mean, I do object to some of the books added. The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, also Circe by Madeline Miller. I don't know why they're on here if the Iliad and the Odyssey aren't, because the Iliad and the Odyssey are far better books. I read The Song of Achilles and I bailed on it. I thought her complete mishandling of Patroclus' character, of her sort of transforming, or basically isekaiing a more contemporary gay or bisexual man into mythological Greece, doesn't work. And also her complete mishandling of like how things would have actually have been, I thought was. And then Circe, I think, is a much stronger book, although again, there's a bit of a contemporary insertion into the ancient world. But my issue with that book more is the absence of Hecate and also the butchering that is done to Athena. And anyway, and then also there's The Changeling by Victor Laval, which I really did not like. And then a few other books on here certainly I do not think are the best fantasy books of all time. And I do think a lot of contemporary fantasy published in the last 10 to 15 years, I think is grossly overrepresented on this list. Especially given the frequency of how many of these books are repeats from the consulting authors. I think all of the consulting authors have one book at least on here. I think George R. Martin and Marlon James only have one. I mean, Marlon James only has one fantasy book to his credit. And with Martin, it's Storm of Swords. But I think, let's go here. 1, because N.K. Jemisin has 3 books on here, at least. Stone Sky. Tomi, yeah, I think she's got 2. Sabaa Tahir has 2. Neil Gaiman's got 2. Which makes me wonder. Whether or not, I mean, that it just makes me uncomfortable. It makes me wonder if there's not some, I mean, obviously, as I mentioned with The Lord of the Rings, whether or not there is some sort of dirty pool going on with some of these later books in the more contemporary section, because there are a significant number of repetitions of several authors having several books on here. And the thing about these kinds of lists, once you get to a more contemporary, a more recent, whether or not they're the best is contingent. It's uncertain because the final decisions haven't been made yet. And again, it makes me wonder what the rationale for this overrepresentation is. I mean, some of the books on here are very interesting. Some of them, I think, will deserve to be on here eventually. Also good for attracting future readers. I mean, which is generally what these lists are best at, is like a recommendation. It's try these books out. Now, whether or not you agree with, whether or not they are the best fantasy of all time, your mileage will most certainly vary. But yeah, I think there's some strong this list is, there were some really strong entries on this list, particularly the earliest ones. I think the children's fantasy probably is quite strong, but the sheer number of repetition of individual authors, especially from the consulting authors, as well as the overrepresentation of more recent books, books from the last 10 to 15 years, if not more like 5 years, is rather egregious and raises so many unfortunate questions. So that's my thought on the 100 best fantasy books according to Time magazine. Anyway, BookTube, I'll sign off from there. Thank you for watching. Have a great afternoon. Stay safe. And if you are so able, please vote. Thank you.